Get this recording going. Perfect. Start sharing my screen again, hopefully more successfully. Yes, perfect. So you guys have all come to learn a bit about Divergence Neuro, the company that a group of divergent individuals have started. Two of them are here right now. Three of them are here right now, Randy, Jeff, and Alex. So thank you guys for coming. We're just going to review the fundamentals of neurofeedback, psychedelics, and their application in psychotherapy through my lens, and take you on a little journey of how I got here and where we're going with Divergence Neuro. There we go. So I really like to look at neurofeedback as relational technology. And when I'm using this technology with clients, I see it as going on a journey into the self. And so it's not that it's a tool that's trying to change who the person is. We're not trying to fix something that's wrong. We're just trying to understand what are the relationships you have with your nervous system and how have those been developed over the lifespan. So here's a few photos of individuals, friends and colleagues and people I've met along the way, including myself. So for those of you who don't work with neurofeedback, this is kind of what it looks like today. We put sensors on the head. I use a technology called BrainMaster. I've got Dr. Michael Winkelman over here on the upper right, and he's an anthropologist who studies altered states, psychedelics, rituals, and shamanism. My colleague, Raphael Lancelota, in the middle. It was his first time getting a qualitative EEG, and he sent me this photo. And he's an expert in 5-MeO-DMT. And then my friend Jose at the bottom left, and he is a virtual reality artist. And we were giving him some gamma PEMF at a psychedelic conference that was happening in Prague. So this is a quote that I often use because I think it, oops, just trying to move you guys out of my way because when I'm talking, I can't see. There we go. I find this quote sets the tone for how I see the interface of these things or these technologies and therapy, and kind of the direction I think our company is going as a whole, and also something that I feel is resonant with a lot of neurofeedback therapists, that there's going to come a time when a disease condition will not be described as it is today by the physicians and the psychologists, but it will be spoken of in musical terms, as one would speak of a piano that is out of tune. So to understand that, we can look at the brain waves and frame the brain waves in the brain kind of along the idea of a choir. So in a choir, we have our low tones, we have our high tones, and we kind of have the tenors in the middle that balance out everything else. And when everyone is singing beautifully and there's this wonderful harmony and you get that prickle up the back of your neck or that sensation through your body, that's kind of when gamma shows up. So we want to see all of these different aspects and all of these different frequencies in the brain nested in such a way that there's an emergence kind of flow or connection that we will see with a gamma frequency. And how we help a choir learn is through feedback. So with neurofeedback, often we kind of have set parameters where you're rewarding something. It's kind of like a high jump. And we will use sound, haptics, or visual feedback, sometimes even light, to indicate when the choir or the brain is doing what we're asking it to do. Other times we want the brain or the choir to sing a little bit quieter, and that's more like a limbo bar. And we use the exact same paradigm of feedback, but we're always rewarding the brain when it's achieving the harmony, whether like a higher or a choir or lower, that we're kind of asking it to do. So states and brainwaves also relate to different stages of development. And when I started really understanding how the brainwaves fit together, it helped me understand what does it mean to look at the brain like a choir, and what does it mean to look at neurofeedback as a relational technology. Well, what we're doing is helping people understand how to relate two different states of awareness and why they may have challenges with different states of awareness. And that can tie to the experiences they had when those different stages of the nervous system were being developed. So delta, for example, is the first frequency that we have. Babies tend to be mostly driven by delta. They don't really have a sense of self that's formulated yet. It's mostly fight, flight, freeze, and orienting. We're orienting towards or away different things. And that has a lot to do with the brainstem. Then as we become more relational and more emotional and we start, investigating the world, we move more into theta states. And this is more related to our limbic system, which is also tied to more of our felt emotional sense of self. And then the alpha rhythm, which is tied to the thalamus, which is kind of the mediator between the conscious and the subconscious mind, and is really kind of set by the age of 10. So it kind of rides upon these lower states, which you can see on the bottom here in this image, that delta and theta kind of represent the subconscious or more the embodied state. And the slower a frequency is, the deeper it's coming from in the nervous system as well. And the earlier kind of that overall tone of that area or that frequency was set. So by about the age of 10, our sense of self, our alpha rhythm, which kind of mediates, like I said, the subconscious and conscious mind is set. And then as we age, we start moving more into beta frequencies where we're starting to move more into the cortex. And again, when all of these are aligned and we're in relationship with these parts, or we're doing something that we really know and understand, we see these emergent gamma moments coming through the brain. And individuals who are constantly in a state of flow, meaning that they're really deeply engaged with their nervous system, you'll sometimes, like deep meditators, you'll see those individuals kind of carrying gamma in their brain at all times.
Did Jam, did you have a question? Oh, Heather, if you're okay with stopping and taking questions.
Yeah, sure. Is there a question?
Saw your hands up, Jam, or is that just a mistake? All right, we'll move on.
Okay.
I have a question at this
Sure.
point. This is so fascinating, the last piece you were talking about. How would this relate to someone who, let's say, has developmental trauma? So they've already had that, or maybe that's too advanced.
We're going to get there. Okay, I'm definitely building up to it. So you are sensing where we are going.
All right, great, thanks.
It's a completely fair question. And that kind of brings us to the next slide, actually, which is great. So now you have this nervous system. And I'm talking about having this relationship with your nervous system so that you can experience, presence and allowing and play and curiosity in the world. But what we often find is that a lot of people struggle, and they find that many states that they enter into are unpleasant, or they're actually avoiding those states. And so we can kind of look at what the body does. And I give this to clients a lot of the time to help them understand where they are kind of hanging out in their overall engagement and tension or relaxation in the nervous system. And Shinzen Young, I was at a conference with him, and he gave me a koan that I felt actually really fit nicely with this, where he said to me, what's the difference between the fire that burns and the fire that warms? And you can kind of see that on this slide, that an intense or exciting arousal in the body can be interpreted by two different people, two different ways. I may find it exciting and I feel amused and I'm happy and delighted. But someone who has a history of trauma where there's a lot of noise in the home, or there's a lot of, anger, you can't do anything right, the parent's always frustrated with you, will actually find this state of arousal. They feel alarmed, they feel annoyed, they feel tense, and they feel angry. And so what we're using the technology for a lot of the time is to highlight the response that's going on in the nervous system in a very objective way. And then you can work with that narratively as a clinician to help that client start developing a new relationship with their nervous system through the relationship they're having with you, while using the technology as a wonderful mediator of honesty or truth or just general objectivity to keep both the clinician and the client connected to what's actually happening in the nervous system in that moment. So my early research during my undergrad was looking at meditation breath attention scores. So before I got into psychedelics, I was really interested in meditation. And what we developed or looked into was recognizing that meditation is both a state and a trait. And there were all these different trait measures of meditation. And nobody was actually looking at how do we measure the state? Sure, you're saying people are having all these traits, but do you actually know that they're practicing states that lead to these traits? And how do we even figure out what states are leading to such traits? And one of the papers I read was by this man named Bishop, who proposed an operational definition for mindfulness in 2004. And he said that curiosity, openness, and acceptance are the three traits that are associated with mindfulness practice. So when somebody is achieving these states of mindfulness, they tend to show these traits. And the importance of that ability to have this psychological flexibility and traverse these different states means that you have an openness and a flexibility in your nervous system that allows you to connect, to experience flow, and to transition. But if different states, for example, more calm states, are uncomfortable because of the trauma you've had, or even activated states are uncomfortable because of the trauma you have, we tend to see a little more isolation and dysregulation in the nervous system, which leads to, what we call as disorders or mental illness, which when I work with my clients, I just say those are really powerful adaptive responses that you had to very rigid and challenging situations. And often it's the situation that leads to the rigidity and the adaptive response, as opposed to you have a disorder or a mental illness. So early neurofeedback research, particularly for addictions and PTSD, used a form of, or a protocol called alpha theta, where we would want to see people come out of their conscious mind, drop through their kind of ego into their subconscious. And they found that this was often really useful in addictions and PTSD. What we noticed also in my lab, so as I was coming out of my meditation research and moving into my master's research, there was a lot of interest around the DMN, which is what's pointed at in the arrows here, and how the DMN is modulating states of trauma, or particularly states of dissociation. And the alpha theta training was primarily modulating the default mode network, which is generally connected to the alpha frequency. So we're trying to quiet alpha so that people go into more of this deep state. But what we noticed in dissociation is that it's actually the opposite. They don't have necessarily a robust alpha frequency. They actually have a lower alpha frequency, which says that they're actually living in more of a dissociative and trancey state to begin with. So we noticed that when we quieted their DMN, there would be this rebound effect, which would bring them back out of the subconscious world and bring them up more into the conscious world. But interestingly, that seemed to be what LSD and psilocybin were doing as well. So from the alpha theta training, they kind of broke it up and they said, well, maybe actually the power in alpha theta is bringing alpha down, and how many times you can quiet alpha seems to lead to this robust rebound effect. Well, psychedelics are doing something similar, but it's not just alpha, it's actually all the way from delta all the way up to beta. So we decided to expand for my master's thesis, looking at what if we made a neurofeedback protocol that mimics the psychedelic state, and we looked across all these different frequencies. And as we modulated or rewarded people for quieting those frequencies in the back of their head, where kind of the sense of self is housed, what would we see? And so we got research from Struders and basically their evaluation of the altered states rating scale, looking across different psychedelics, including psilocybin and MDMA. And we saw that psychedelic neurofeedback actually wasn't that unlike what we were seeing with psychedelics. So people had these experiences of unity, this blissful state, a sense of insightfulness, kind of a sense of disembodiment, which makes sense because we're kind of pulling them into trance and then popping them up into the moment, lowering of anxiety, and some more audio-visual synesthesia, which we see with psychedelics because as the self drops, more bottom-up connectivity comes up, and we can start feeling more of our emotions, hearing more sensations, things start to cross. And a lot of the participants who were in my research reported to me too that they noticed they had this elevation in mood, they had improved focus, they felt calm, relaxed, tranquil, they had vivid dreams and their senses increased, an altered sense of time and spontaneous processing. And I got this information because I would run participants through this protocol, which would be about 15 minutes long. They'd be watching a screen with either different images on it that were being uncovered as they achieved the state, as they quieted their DMN, or a screen that kind of flickered. And as they quieted the DMN, the screen would clear. And when they were started thinking again, the screen would come back and they would lose their focus and be forced to kind of quiet their mind again and go back into that state. And then I would send them an email and ask them the next day, just what have you noticed in the last 24 hours? And as we looked through the different feedback that people had given us, we noticed that it was very similar to what people were reporting with psychedelics. It was very similar to what people were reporting even with microdosing. So as I finished all of this research, I really wasn't sure exactly where to go. And I started reading more and more into the neurofeedback world. And I found a chapter in an EEG book about neuromeditation. And I very quickly found Jeff through one of the online trainings, and I went to Cleveland, Ohio and trained in neuromeditation. And neuromeditation was actually early in my neurofeedback training. I did a lot of the other trainings following it because it spoke to me, because I had done so much research in this area. I was just like, oh, I already kind of seem to innately understand this. And Jeff and I got along really well from the start. We had a wonderful dinner where we talked about all these synergies, and he hadn't really considered how much more we could be expanding the deep states areas of neuromeditation. And so we ended up presenting together at the International Society for Neurofeedback Research, and I've continued training with him, and now I'm one of the trainers and teachers and mentors for the Neuromeditation Institute itself. And what I like about neuromeditation is I feel it's a really accessible way of working with neurofeedback in a relational way, and that it's easy as an entry point to start working with neurofeedback and starting to understand how all of this really modulates and falls together. And so the one metaphor that we tend to use when we're teaching is the idea that neuromeditation is like being in a garden. And these 4 styles of neuromeditation that are included have to do with modulating your different states so that you learn to be in relationship with the full spectrum of your nervous system. And these are based on traditional meditative practices that had really already figured this out. All Jeff did was look at the science and then develop a feedback modality that would help people just validate that they were actually entering into the states they were seeking or practicing and not just mind wandering. So if you imagine a garden, when we do a focused meditation, we're focusing on just one flower in the garden. When we move into mindfulness meditation, we're actually looking at the garden as a whole. So if a butterfly goes by, or if it's a bit of wind, or you're looking at different flowers, you don't get fixed on any one of those things like you would in a focused meditation. Quiet mind is actually being in the garden at night. So it's recognizing that you're in the garden, but being able to drop any attention on it, and in a way that everything gets dark and you can sit in the peace of being in the garden without being distracted by anything that's going on in the garden. And then loving kindness meditation is really when the fragrance that emerges from the flowers and the way that makes you feel, the peace you feel from being in the garden, how sweet you think the little bunny that's going by is, and how the sensation that emerges from that interaction. And so as I continued to work with the neuromeditations and working with my clients, I really started recognizing that there seemed to be traits associated with training these specific states. So the metaphor that I use when I'm teaching and that we've started using at the Neuromeditation Institute is to help clients understand that there are these core networks in the brain that need to be exercised and connected in particular ways, and that the frequencies that we see in the brain kind of dance on top of. So when you're well toned, if you were going to the gym, that would be kind of like that gamma frequency. Your body allows you to do what you want it to do. You're balanced between your upper body, your core, and your lower body. So we're looking for that balance in a similar way, but with these specific networks in the brain. And these networks modulate how you connect to the world around you. So your default mode network, which we talked about when we were talking about alpha, remember, and that was built upon delta, theta, and then alpha. It's that early sense of self. That's related to our default mode network. So how we self-reference when our mind is wandering, we're hanging out in the default mode network. The handlebars are really about our ability to kind of choose where we're going and have flexibility and curiosity in our mind instead of being hyper fixated or kind of too dreamy and unfocused. So we want a nice sense of curiosity there. And with the default mode network, when we have a nice bike that's the the tires are pumped up and the chain is oiled and our feet are nicely on the pedals, and the frame is actually suited well for the kind of bike riding we want to do, we can have a sense of acceptance and equanimity as we go about the world. But it's the person on the bike. This is the salience network and our openness to experience that kind of drives how fast we ride the bike, how relaxed we are on the bike. And so it makes a lot of sense that all of these, or at least I think it makes a lot of sense that all of these kind of need to hang together in order for us to experience this state of flow. And different meditation practices teach us how to work with these different states. So focus helps you with your curiosity and your concentration. Mindfulness is more about that sensory clarity, that ability to just kind of be in your body, be open to what's happening inside and open to what's happening outside of the world so that you can be relaxed on the bike. And then the default mode network is really working through that early architecture of your life, the things you've gone through, and developing a relationship with all of your childhood parts so that they come in support instead of, you know, having flat tires or a broken chain that makes it hard for you to ride. And Shinzen Young, this was again his kind of triangle that he uses when he's teaching mindfulness. And when I saw this plus Bishop's work, I was like, wow, there's a really genuine overlap here that seems to tie to these three networks in the brain that we seem to be teaching people. And I see these traits emerging from them as they get better at practicing these states. So again, just like a little review here, if we're using neuromeditation as a state education focus, helps us control our attention, which is tied to that beta frequency that we were talking about earlier. It's good for someone, for example, with ADHD because it's very activating for the mind. Mindfulness is about observing. And when we're observing, we move a little more into a softer state, a theta state. This can be really helpful for stress and anxiety and calming the nervous system. Quiet mind is that spacious awareness, heavily tied to alpha, which is that root or that middle way, kind of like the balancing of the teeter-totter. And this is helpful for a disrupted sense of self. It's really good for calming, also useful for PTSD. And then open heart meditations tend to actually rely on all three of the previous ones being in place, because moving into embodied compassion and a sense of loving connection requires you to be focused, mindful, and be able to quiet your mind. This is good for depression and relationship issues, grief, and it's also considered an activating practice. So if we're thinking about this from a sense of relationship and using technology to be relational and gaining this ability to identify what state you're in, identify when certain moods and emotions are telling you that perhaps you are not in a relationship, and then being able to understand how to relate to that and to be motivated to take action so that you can then again achieve a state of peace and allowing until something new shows up, is in some ways you can call the ability to have perceptual diversity, or something that a lot of traditional cultures had, which we can say they were very polyphasic, meaning that they didn't only use their conscious mind, but they also used their subconscious mind, which means the wholeness of their nervous system to move about in the world and be engaged. And I think our current world and our current use of technology tends to be more monophasic, where it's a little more science oriented, it's very cognitively oriented, it's very what you see in front of you instead of what you feel inside and what you feel from others around you, or taking the time to check in with your nervous system and being very honest about where you're at. And so when we are connecting and engaged in this polyphasic or perceptual capacity, we find that there's a more flexible use of neural networks, and that allows you to have more easy access to a variety of perceptual processes. But then this overlap with psychedelics, when they looked at psilocybin assisted mindfulness training and how that modulates the default mode network and this connectivity, they saw that it increased DMN flexibility, enabling the brain to have more adaptive allocation of brain resources, which is pretty much the same thing in many ways. So we know from recent research coming out of Imperial that, all of their findings are showing that psychedelics seem to lead us to this ability to have this hyperplastic state, aiding rapid and deep learning that can mediate psychological transformation. But how are we going to harness that? How do you get that flexibility, and that's great. Your DMN suddenly becomes more flexible and you have this openness to the ability to go deeper and work with your earlier states of self, and then figuring out how that has been resonating and affecting your ego and how you're engaging with the world around you. But what does this mean for each individual who's entering into a psychedelic state? How do we know that what we think can happen, that they can have this pivotal mental state, is actually going to happen? And so a recent research that just came out, which is about predicting reactions to psychedelic drugs, a systematic review of states and traits related to the acute drug effect, showed that so far, individuals who are likely to have a mystical effect or that pivotal mental state that leads to long-term changes are high on the traits of absorption, openness, and acceptance, which is pretty much similar to what we're seeing with meditation. And those individuals who really struggled actually were low on surrender, were more preoccupied, they had more apprehension, and they had more confusion, which would say to me that they were struggling with a polyphasic mindset. But if you're struggling with that, it's for good reason. And usually it's very protective. So we want to be really thoughtful and careful about where we're pushing people with these psychedelics, that it's not just a cure. It's not like you can just boop, drop something in someone's brain and suddenly they're in relationship with everything. We have to understand that if individuals are still hanging out in this preoccupied, apprehensive, and confused place, maybe it could be useful to be training them and guiding them through relational technology until they're actually into this absorptive, open, and acceptance state, so that they can really work with the psychedelic that's being handed to them. And this is what they said at the conclusion of their paper, said, if states and traits to facilitate the benefits of psychedelics become firmly established, then a natural question will be how to alter those baseline variables to enhance treatment effects, which is something that we're really focused on at Divergence. So here's an image of Jay Gunkelman. He is one of our scientific advisors, and he's kind of the guy who figured out that there's actually these phenotypes tied to EEG. There's about 12 of them, and they're an intermediate step between genetics and behavior. They're semi-stable states of neurophysiological function. They cut across the DSM categories, and the phenotypes actually have proven to predict the individual's response to therapy, both for neurofeedback as well as for medication. So the next question is, why are we not applying this in psychedelics? And as we've started asking that question, we've actually been finding that this is a very useful way of moving forward. And this is something that we're really interested in having as part of our core platform to inform clinicians and users of where is your starting point. Like if you go clothing shopping, it helps to know, even though all of our bodies are unique and different, it helps to know generally what size you are so that you can appropriately pick the clothes that will fit you. And I think the same is true for medication. It's what we have seen works in the Neuromeditation Institute. People have far better results when they start with a meditation that meets their nervous system where they are. And I think the same is going to be true for psychedelics. So we're in this decade of translation. There's a wonderful book by Yuri Kroptov, who's really well known in the field. And he's really designed and figured out or developed that there's these functional neuromarkers in psychiatry. And that as we move into this decade of translation, I think it's time we start using these neuromarkers, using EEG for personalized care and to prevent disease, but also for psychedelic research. So we have a partnership going on right now that's particularly looking at biomarkers of different psychedelic substances. And we are starting with DMT in particular, and we are working with a company called Entheon for this. So our goal is to develop an EEG based system of subjective assessment that will be based on AI and machine learning to offer these predictive biomarkers, create a software platform that makes it really easy for clinicians to see when a client has hit the targeted biomarker, when we know that they are entering into that pivotal mental state, their brain has truly reached that point. But beyond that, the Divergence platform in and of itself is also really interested in phenotyping individuals and making sure we understand where they are starting and are they even ready to take that psychedelic, which is likely going to target that biomarker and lead to long-term outcomes. And then can we use the technology to also enhance long-term outcomes once we see the differences between the pre and post psychedelic experience, much like we use with neurofeedback right now, where I can get a sense of pre and post clinical intervention. How is it going for my client during the session because I have them hooked up to the technology. So our overall platform, to kind of offer a broader view of it, we've used this metaphor of a kitchen. So the Divergence platform and the phenotypes we'll be offering will be much like the kitchen in and of itself. The biomarkers that we develop will, in these algorithms that will be part of the platform, are kind of like the special sauce of the different spices that you have on your rack. Therapists who become trained in using this platform will be like the cooks, and the variety of headsets that we have will be like utensils. The chefs, teachers, and lineages are kind of, or the chefs are the teachers and lineages. It's really important to us that we work together with the neurofeedback community. There's a wonderful history of mentors, studies, and individuals who really understand the depth of what this technology can do. And I think it's important that as we are moving into the future with more brain-computer interfaces and putting that with VR and doing all these different things, that we remember that you still need to be trained and you still need to understand how to navigate that. And as we can open up these trainings, we can increase access. And then the recipes and the applications are kind of like the protocols that we will put. So as different individuals learn how to work with this, there'll kind of be a recipe deck that you can kind of look through as you become a cook. But our headsets, these utensils, we're hoping to have a really wide variety of them on the platform. So here's two of our hardware partners that we're launching with as we move forward in the next couple of months. We have the Neurosity Crown and we have the Newphony. And our idea is to be hardware agnostic. We kind of want to be the central hub that you can go to and the software that you can learn to use, but then easily switch and choose the utensils depending on the recipes that you're trying to cook. So here's a couple images of our web and mobile applications. So far, we're getting very close to beta testing. So I'm really excited. In the upper right, you can kind of see that we'll have live images of what's going on in the brain, different metrics to help you understand where your client is at, that high jump or low jump, and seeing kind of where they are on a web as we do the assessments, giving you a really well-rounded overview of how a client's training is going and how they are kind of moving along on the treatment modality. What will be novel and new about what we're doing, and I'm really excited about this, and this is kind of why I poked Alex in the beginning to make these headsets or make the software platform to get this going is because the biggest challenge I have is that between sessions, it's hard for clients to always remain on task. And maybe in the session, I was able to help you achieve this deep state where you could connect with the younger part and we could start working through this avoidance pattern you have that is limiting your ability to really allow and be present in your life. And then you go home and you kind of remember it the next day. And then as the days go by, it gets harder, life gets busy, you forget. But with this platform, I can say, hey, put on your headset, check in, how's it going? Let's do a little bit of a neuro meditation, bring you back to that state. And so just like going to the gym, if a personal trainer gives you a fitness training, but you don't exercise, you're not going to see gains. And so sometimes clients come back and it just takes us a little bit longer to get them on track because it's harder for them to learn, and that's not their fault. It's just there isn't access to the feedback that they need to deepen their experience. So beyond that, we're hoping that this is going to really deepen the therapeutic alliance above and beyond anything else, because Carl Rogers really framed it well with this quote that in my early years, I was asking the question, how can I treat or cure or change this person? But now I would phrase the question in this way, how can I provide a relationship in which this person may use for her own personal growth? Our entire nervous system from birth until the point you sit here today and talk to me is based on relationships. How you feel about different things was based on experiences that you've had. And while a lot can be done on your own, when it comes to, say, trauma, based on the question earlier, or even just different experiences you didn't have, not everyone can really transcend or get beyond that on their own. Now, I know there's a spectrum of individuals on the extrovert to introvert, and some do. But many of us at our core really truly do need relationship in order to make sustainable changes in our nervous system. And I mean, really that's the platform of how therapy works at this time. But when there's a history of trauma or stress, it can be really hard to trust, and it can be really hard to be objective, and it can take clients time to really open up. In my experience is that the technology helps us mediate that, because it's just an honest, objective measure that we can talk about that kind of takes away the pressure of having to relate when relationship wasn't safe in the past. So we're proposing this idea of state education and using neurofeedback to attune our embodied awareness. So bringing us back into our deeper states of self and bringing those online so that we can have more of this perceptual diversity, both in our conscious and embodied self, that highlights and cultivates deeper harmonic relationships with aspects of our states of awareness. For those who are interested in learning more, we are really kind of at the cusp of designing all of this and moving this forward. So the Neuromeditation Institute is clearly one place you can go to learn neuromeditation. If you go to the website, there's the 4 styles quiz on there. We even have a free mini course. There's a lot of free meditations on there. They've done a wonderful job of bringing a pretty full suite that's easy to access on their website. And then within the psychedelic community, I'm really honored and excited to be part of the Mind Foundation and their augmented psychotherapy training. And the neuromeditation training is kind of going to be one of the core foundational pieces that the individuals in this training will be practicing over the 3 years, because it's really important that clinicians, it's not just about how can you support the person, what lens do you understand, what technique do you know, but what do you know about your own state? What do you know about how you function as a person, how you respond to things? And we have the potential of adding some of these technologies in to help clinicians deepen their own awareness and their own ability to co-regulate their clients and to know this in a way that's really clear and concrete and has been trained through objective assessment. So in conclusion, I guess the overall theme of what I was talking about in general is that until you make the unconscious conscious, it could direct your life and you could call it fate. But as we move into more polyphasic awareness, and as we bring technologies into the world that don't just siphon our attention, but actually hand our awareness and the depths of who we are back to ourselves, we're starting to use technology in a relational way. So you can get more information at either of these websites. And thank you guys for listening.
Does anybody have any other questions or comments?
I have a comment and a question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
First of all, Heather, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's just a quick reflection. You know, I look at sort of like the last year and what's happened, and I think, you know, starting to look at everything from a mental health lens, from the fact that there's so much uncertainty, and us as people and culturally, we've hit the sort of like the bottom limit of like a cultural cognition in a way, that we're not able to juggle and be agnostic to all the complexity and the conflicting information. And so to hear something like polyphasic awareness, like, it's just fantastic. It reminds me of Ken Wilber's work.
Yeah.
So a quick question on this. And I come from the enterprise software world, where the conversation around employee mental health is a big thing. You know, there's a Gartner report that came out recently that they're saying in the very near future, we're going to see chief mental health officers, roles like that, come in to look at employee well-being across the entire organization. So I'm looking at something like what you presented. Can it be networked in terms of like a group experience? And from that perspective, what sort of like, I know there's a phenotype for what state they're in.
Yep.
But in terms of like maybe extrapolating that into like, okay, this is the sort of the creativity or the collaboration mode or something like that. I'm just wondering if you have any comments about that.
Yeah, all of that is completely doable. We did a lot of stuff in the lab where we did 2-person neurofeedback, and we would enter into states together. And I think that I had worked on a team before. We were looking at something we called the corporate, like the emotional thermostat, where you could get a read of how everyone is feeling. Can you imagine sitting down in a boardroom and everybody having to enter into like a harmonic state before they begin speaking? And then even feedback showing up during the conversation. If people are getting really tense and they're going so high into beta, you're just like, yeah, nobody's listening anymore. Like, clearly everyone's gone into their own head, and there being a cue of some sort that helps people stay connected. A lot of people would not want that, you know, they'd like fight that idea. So I think that's going to be the piece that if people sign up for it and they're open to it and they've learned about it and they understand that it's not about controlling anyone, it's just offering objective assessment that helps all of us become more collaborative, more self-aware, more compassionate, that, yeah, I think it could be a really powerful tool.
Thank you.
I like the idea too of even individuals, you know, you get your headset on, you're watching different shows, you're scrolling social media, you're starting to get like a notification like, hey, you know, you're actually getting really stressed out with what you're doing. And you may not even recognize you're getting stressed out because you're dissociating.
Right.
Which is happening more and more during the pandemic, like functional dissociation is a coping strategy right now. So helping people after the pandemic, I think that's when we're going to see the biggest challenge. It's the PTSD sets in when the threat is over. Yeah, and the nervous system needs to now recover.
I have another question. I don't know if somebody else, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but it's really
So
fascinating.
let Monique
Go ahead.
ask, and then you can ask again, because I saw Monique raise her hand too.
Yeah, thanks. Such a good presentation, Heather. Oh my gosh, it maps on like so much to other spiritual things I've read and just about mindfulness. Like it's so cool that science is like mapping this out. I'm just wondering, like, with the training, like when you talk about your clients and they'll go home and they have the app, so are you saying that they're taking home like the technology with them to practice with, or do they have to purchase it on their own?
So we are working on a few different things. I think Jeff can answer this question probably better than I can.
Yeah, sure. So I think, Monique, it's unclear exactly how this is going to work today, but you know, a couple ideas that we've had that we think are going to be the most effective. One, we really think that it makes a lot of sense for the therapist to own kind of the entire stack of technology, because that way they can reuse it for different customers over and over again, so they can kind of lend it out to their customers as they need it. But the idea would be this. essentially the therapist has the tools, right, which would be the Divergence platform. Maybe they've subscribed to some of the Neuromeditation Institute therapies or protocols. They maybe have designed their own protocols that they've put in our application. And then they send their patient home with one or more headsets, depending on what protocols they might need the headsets for, as well as the patient would download our mobile app onto their phone. They connect that all together, and then that allows the therapist to basically watch, how the patient's progressing through the therapy treatment protocols that they've assigned to them. So that's one way. The other way that we've obviously talked to a variety of different hardware vendors about is, potentially having the individual, the patient, purchase the hardware themselves. This is maybe a little bit less likely, at least in the short term, due to all kinds of insurance reasons in, the US and Canada. Be hard maybe for some patients to afford that capital outlay because, unlikely that the insurance companies are going to pick up the tab today. So maybe when FDA approvals are there and there's efficacy shown and research that shows that, these things are related, then maybe insurance companies start paying for it. But we probably think the most likely scenario is therapist owns it all and then lends it out to their patients as part of the service they're providing and charges accordingly for that service.
Yeah, because I'm just wondering, I was just looking at, what's it called? My friend lent me his biofeedback stuff, and I think it's, anyways, it starts at $10,000.
Yeah. So two of the devices that we showed in this presentation today, the Neurosity and the Nufini devices, those are around or sub $1,000 US. So those are a little bit cheaper. Now, you can't do absolutely everything with them, right? They have limitations in terms of what they cover on the head. But you're right. A lot of the devices today are in the 10,000 plus range, right? The in-clinic stuff is $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. There's no way, a patient is going to be able to afford that. So that's why we think this kind of, therapist-owned lending model, it makes the most sense for at least the short term.
And the idea too, is that you really should be with the therapist when you're doing deep shifts and deep movements. So we're launching primarily with the neuromeditations and things that clients can do on their own. And what's really great is that the headsets at least offer tracking. So, your client goes home, you're like, how'd you do? And they come back, I don't know, and they see the world through their own biased lens. Even if they don't want to train, they just put the thing on their head and it's like, or the sensors on their head. And it's like, hey, it's a Fitbit for your brain, right? And our app is going to ask them questions that you as a clinician have chosen that's specific for what they need. And it's like, here's your task that week, and we've kind of gamified it to make it fun and engaging. And it's a way of just mediating that time between sessions. And then as things progress and a clinician wants to move a little deeper and a client's a little more comfortable, they could start doing some more deeper trainings at home as well. Mm-hmm. And again, it's the utensils, depends on the recipe you want to cook. So which headset would you need may change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes so much sense. I feel like it makes so much sense. I'm just trying to wrap my head around, and it's interesting that you guys are kind of trying to wrap your head around what's the best way to make this accessible. Because I'm just thinking, $10,000 is not feasible, but a couple hundred, or maybe the renting out model. But I hear what you're saying. You need to kind of be in presence with your therapist, and that's why. So when you say the beta version, is that what you're talking about, like the app?
Yeah, the trial.
Yeah. So roughly mid to late May is when we'll have our beta software available. So that'll be our backend platform. So the web software that Heather showed, as well as the mobile app for patients. Both things will be available kind of mid to end May. And then of course, we'd have to find a way, if you're going to be part of the beta testing group, which I think you are, Monique, we'd have to find a way to get you some hardware that would work with it, right? Because obviously we're not providing the hardware ourselves.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Yeah. I'm just I'm in the process of opening a smaller practice here, and the two clinicians who want to work with me are trauma focused, and I would like to put trauma lens for this. And in my community, there's only 100,000 people. So it would be really nice to have this offered. So yeah, that's really exciting. Cool.
Yeah, I should mention one other kind of model we've talked to some of the hardware providers about. A couple of them are more warm than others to it, is the idea that they would maybe provide the hardware on a rented basis. So it's more of like a hardware as a service type of a model where you pay some monthly fee and you just get the hardware, and if something happens with the hardware, you send it back, they send you a new one, or if a new version comes out, they send you a new one. Or that kind of a service where you're paying monthly for it as opposed to having to pay for it all up front.
Okay, very cool. Thank you.
Yeah. So Rod, did you want to, what was your other question? Thanks, Monique.
Does anyone else have a question?
I have a number of questions actually, but
Okay.
I'm so fascinated, with this whole the way this works for working with trauma, particularly as more has been my focus, and so I'm just curious about a number of pieces, and I guess it's the one thing that you were saying about how people that are more open will have a better psychedelic experience, and if you're using this neurofeedback to tune people up so that they are in that state, well, then do they even need to do the psychedelic? It's kind of like if it's work, the
So there is totally not always necessary. I mean, I do really well with my clients without. However, I will say there are clients where I really think it could benefit if I could strategically put that piece in there, that
Right.
it just would soften up everything. So it's like they've gone and done a sauna or something before a massage, just makes it a little bit easier. So
Right.
on occasion, someone's been in that state for such a long time that having that flush can be pretty powerful. But is it necessary? Nope.
Right. So bringing me to this other piece about the trauma is when you're, so one thing that I've worked with, worked through the Psychedelic Somatic Institute. And so one of the sayings that we have there is that consider the mystical experience as a resource and not a cure.
Yes.
So it's like we want to get into the trauma piece, which is uncomfortable and difficult, and to kind of break through.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious as to how this, because it sounds like you can, make this work in a way that you can actually maybe help release trauma in the body, or, it's through the neurofeedback process and tuning this up. It's, I'm curious about how this actually
sorry, go ahead.
How
does that?
how does that exactly kind of work? Sort of this, at least conceptually, like if I know, let's say I'm doing something, I'm tuned into my body, I'm feeling the feelings that I didn't feel when I was younger. Let's say maybe I have a Peter Levine kind of, release, and then it's you've sort of gone through it. So how does this fit into that model of, or help, or, change a different way of doing that?
So I joke that the alpha down, or the 1 to 20 protocol that was my thesis, or even alpha theta, which is quieting the DMN, is like a plunger for the subconscious. We're just like, and then it's like, poof, it comes up. So psychedelics do it, certain meditations do it, certain somatic practices do it, holotropic breath work does it, anything that drops the DMN basically does that. What I like about the technology is I can walk people into it with feedback so they understand the progressive overload of not just being shoved off the cliff. And I can help them basically get there a little more gently and then come out of it, and then help them integrate it a little bit more easily. So it's more of it's relational, right? We've walked up to this place together. We've used the technology to keep you with me. I'm giving you feedback on, oh, you're getting a little bit tense. Are you noticing that? No, I'm fine. I'm like, well, but I see this tension. So let's work on that before we take the big leap. And that took some time. And there are people that you can try to walk them there and they're still just going to fall off the cliff and have the explosion anyway. But just being able to validate them through that process is how I see this is really useful, and how I've been using it myself.
Sounds wonderful. Is there sort of a sense of time, like months or weeks, or number of sessions, rough? Or would that also partially depend on how traumatized someone is?
So the answer is always it depends.
Yeah.
Some people it's very quickly we could go there, and other people less. I use the metaphor of, so if you imagine an ocean, and if we kind of look at that, remember that wheel that I had with the fire, what's the difference between the fire that burns and the fire that warms? there are individuals who are kind of like parasailers and they're hanging out in their perceptual biases and they're in beta and they're up here. And then you've got your more dissociative folks who are like deep sea divers or hanging out in the ocean. I'm just trying to get people to float on top. I just want you to be able to float on top. I want you to be able to look up and I want you to be able to look down. Parasailing people can be really tricky because they've gotten really good at avoiding. So they can sometimes actually take a little bit longer. Interestingly, the folks who are a little more dissociative, they're the challenging ones, but I find with this technology, they're the easier ones. And there's like a poetry in that because I've already fragmented and had everything fall apart, that they're a little less rigid to bringing them up than bringing people down. So it kind of depends on your starting point and your phenotype, actually, in my experience.
Sounds great. I'll take a pause. I could talk to you forever, I think.
I have a question, and it may be too much to cover in this venue, but I didn't see any mention of things like vulnerability and resilience post-therapy, where when you're looking at things like openness and mindfulness and softening, that also creates vulnerabilities where people are open to suggestion and some kind of reprogramming, maybe unintentional reprogramming, and a level of resilience is needed to kind of adapt to or push back those ideas. What are your thoughts on how that incorporates into the model that you're building here?
So this is why we're targeting the clinical market. It's exactly that reason. You know, I'm not going direct to consumer for that fear, because and I think that that's the thing that I'm most concerned about in the psychedelic community too, is how vulnerable people are after a psychedelic experience. They're all flexible and open, and they got 2 weeks of high entropy. And if something shocking or difficult happens during that time, you could actually hypnotically suggest, because they're more suggestible, that deeper into their system while they're flexible. And then that becomes a new thing that you've got to work through. So our goal is to really put this in the hands of clinicians who are well-trained and can understand. And we're also kind of challenging clinicians to, you know, validate themselves. You know, are you suggesting things to your client? Is your client improving? You know, I get plenty of clients who come see me who, you know, CBT is really important. It's an important part of therapy, but the clinician almost gets annoyed with them because they're not able to do CBT. And then they start, you know, kind of fawning to the clinician to make the clinician feel good, which just reinforces their trauma. And then the clinician is like, I can't help you, which reinforces their trauma. And then they feel broken and they've got to go on drugs. So
you're talking about conditioned behaviorism as opposed to like adaptive therapy.
Yeah.
Right.
So
where the clinician is basically telling the patient how to react instead of looking for authentic reaction.
So this really adds an objective measure to keep both the clinician and the client accountable. And this is why I like the technology too, is I can see if my client is changing. I can objectively measure it and say to them, oh yeah, we have noticed your tension has come down. And what does that feel like for you?
Yeah, so I guess what my question is do you have biomarkers or specific ways to brain map that the level of vulnerability that somebody may be in when they come out of a psychedelic state? Because that's something that I'm really intensely focused on trying to figure out.
That's why we want to talk.
Because
I think
like
that's
my initial research way back in the day was on hypnotherapy and behaviorism and cult induction techniques and a lot of peer pressure and stress testing. And there's just by looking at a person's eyes and like the pallor in their face and, you know, the way that their facial muscles move, you can kind of tell how softened and vulnerable a person is and how long that state lasts. And this is all, you know, cult leader tactics. But I don't know if clinicians are really are really taught to look at the same thing and understand how, you know, fragile a person is when they are in that state.
I think trauma therapists who are really deeply steeped in dissociation are, but is that the majority? No. So I think that is something that's lacking. I think you're really hitting the nail on the head. And I think it's an important thing to investigate and that I would like to see the platform offer. I think that would be very valuable. Do we offer it yet? No.
It's something I'm really intensely interested in looking at, and that the literature really doesn't cover very much at all. I mean, at least
No.
in the mid-70s.
Yeah, I think it's something that those of us who have an interest in it, I've studied a lot of occult stuff too, just have learned and picked up along the way. And
Yeah.
as I move people into deep states, I can see that in them, and I will express, go for a walk or sit here with me, or bring them, SMR training to kind of bring them back to themselves before I send them out into the world. But yeah, no, these are very important aspects to consider. And they're not, I don't even know if it's being looked at with psychedelics. Everyone's just so focused on the mystical experience, they're forgetting everything else.
There was one paper published earlier this year, which I think it was Roland Griffiths and Alicia Danforth, talked about the vulnerability states that are engendered post-psychedelic therapy, and how this is a time when therapists may unconsciously engage in personally directed forms of abuse, or control dynamics, where they just slip into these control dynamics when the patient becomes vulnerable, whether or not they're predatory or not. It's just a natural thing that happens. So that was one of the first papers I saw on it. So hopefully there'll be more in the future.
Yeah, definitely.
I was just going to add into that. I mean, really every closing circle that I've ever been in, whether it's at a retreat or after a dance or any sort of really opening experience, this comes up about, oh, well, how do I go back into the regular world this open? It's kind of scary.
It is.
So it is, because sometimes you feel like the breeze can blow through you. And when you are at that state, how to then carry that into the world and its challenges and maybe sharper edges.
Definitely. I see this after yoga class half the time. I want to sit with my class students and just take our time before we go outside and drive or anything. Make sure everybody's back in the room. No, it's a super important piece. Thank you, James, for bringing that up.
Sure.
I have a question about meditation, if no one else has. And this is something that, working in this psychedelic somatic modality, I've seen where sometimes people that are good meditators are also good at avoidance, because they slip right into that little state there. So how does this kind of fit in, with the meditation, the neuromeditation stuff?
Well, with the neuromeditation stuff, it's kind of a joke in the neurofeedback community a little bit. You'll get someone that shows up, I've been meditating for 10 years, and you put sensors on their head and you say, you've been mind wandering. Actually, you're not genuinely entering into those states. And so you kind of can't really avoid, I can see if you're going there or not. So it really brings about that honest feedback. So that's why it's such a useful tool, I find. That's
great. And it's not, and can that be used, assuming someone is a good meditator that can hold a state? Yep. Can that still be an avoidance of, let's say, your deeper traumas? Yeah, so they did really interesting research in Plum Village. So I don't know how familiar everyone is with Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh had a stroke, and he was so dysregulated and suffering that his attendants were really feeling upset. Now, Seaburn Fisher is a really well-known neurofeedback therapist in the field, and she studies developmental trauma, and she'd been following Thich Nhat Hanh for quite some time. So she approached him and said, I think that I could help you with neurofeedback. And so he allowed her to do this. And within a week or so, his night terrors had calmed down. He was becoming more regulated. She also started training his attendants who had become very stressed out. And Plum Village actually opened their doors to research. And I know a lot of the therapists who went in there and worked with them, and they found that they could meet these meditators where they were at. They were these really deep meditators, and yet they were still struggling with something. I've actually had a couple of meditators, even monks, contact me for this very reason. And we've kind of talked through some of these pieces where, I feel like meditation really helps with
if you're looking at yourself as a tree, it helps with the branches and it helps, collecting all the light and everything, but you need to be attending to the roots. And sometimes folks are really so focused on getting the sun that they forget about the roots, but the roots oftentimes are very relational. And so you need that relationship to be able to go a little bit deeper into the roots. And so the technology was brought in, and they would see where there was still a sticky point in their brain or kind of like a trauma hanging out, and they would train them in that spot. And then that meditator would finally feel that unlock, like, oh, I'm finally there. So it has been used. And I find that actually really advanced meditators are actually quite aware of where they can't. And it's not that they're avoiding it. Sometimes they don't even know how to get there. And so they're still seeking it.
Right, that makes good sense. And the root piece, so the relational piece that you were just mentioning, is that done through the client therapist with the headsets on, so it's still a relational with a person as opposed to the relationship with the technology?
Yeah, so between sessions, clients could be using relational technology, but they're still connected to a clinician that's supporting them. And I do think that as people get more adept, they can use the technology more on their own. But in the beginning, and if you have something that comes up, it's helpful to have, a regulating other to sit and listen and reflect with.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. So I think we're
Really
getting,
quick.
we're about, yeah.
Can I just, this is actually, Paul, what was the name of the organization that you were talking about that you are part of?
Psychedelia Integration in Los Angeles. And
Psychedelia Integration?
Psychedelia, yeah, integration. And we have like group integration circles and provide like educational events, like having someone like Heather speak or something like that. Right.
Integration. Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, psychedeliaintegration.org is the website.
Very cool.
All right, well, we're at 2:15, so we're a little over. So we're going to call it here. But if anybody has any other questions or comments, you can find us, as Heather mentioned, at divergenceneuro.com, or you can send us an email at info@divergenceneuro.com. We're happy to take additional questions.
And Todd, you're welcome to give us a closing chime.
Yeah.
It's a little hard to hear.
Awesome.
But I appreciate the vibe. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your time today.
I'm still learning how to steer this microphone thing.
Right on.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Have a great day.
Really great. Bye, everyone.
Welcome.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Very,
You're
very interesting.
welcome.